Okay, here's the next video lecture series for my Intro to Psychology students and some of my lifespan development students. Again, anytime you talk about theory or history in a classroom, sometimes students kind of zone out a little bit. So I'm going to do my best to bring to life a little bit of the history of psychology. I know this is an intro class, but I think it's very important to at least understand a little bit about the history of what we're studying this semester. So that's where we're going at this point. One of my professors at State, when I went to West Virginia State College, at the time it was West Virginia State College, always said psychology has a long history but a short past. I thought, what the heck does that mean? Well, we'll talk about that. But before that, random cute pet picture. That's my dog Jake. So there you go. Well, here's what that means. Psychology officially began as a science in 1879, like we talked about in the first video, in Leipzig, Germany, by Wilhelm Wundt. It's pronounced with a V, even though it's spelled with a W. Now, that's not too long ago. Therefore, we're talking about psychology having a short past, if you will. That right there. However, psychology has a very long history because the influence of psychology go way back to the time of the ancient Greeks. Wilhelm Wundt, again, was the founder of psychology. He's given credit as being our founding father. That's important to know. I will not ask you to memorize or know any dates on any of my exams, by the way. The only date I will ever ask you to remember in this class is this one right here, 1879. That's the year psychology officially got its start. So, Mr. Wundt, psychology's influence goes way, way back, even further than that. We could go back to Hippocrates. You studied the ancient Greek physician probably in other classes. Hippocrates lived from 460 BC to 370 BC. So we're going back a long, long time here. He was the first modern physician. I mean, he was really way ahead of his time. He was the first person that we know of who was diagnosing and recognizing paranoia. If you're paranoid, if someone's paranoid, they feel like someone's out to get them, to cause them harm to a greater extent than is true. Phobias. A phobia is an intense and irrational fear. Some people are afraid of spiders, heights, dogs. I had a client who had a phobia of cotton balls. It could be pretty strange. Postpartum depression. He was the first that we know of to recognize that women have a chemical depression sometimes after they deliver their babies. And he recommended some pretty common sense things like taking a bath, getting clean, relaxation, listening to music, proper diet, some common sense stuff that we think of today, but back during this time was pretty groundbreaking stuff. Socrates was another ancient Greek philosopher. He came after. Sorry about that. Okay, Socrates. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. Was an ancient Greek philosopher who had a profound impact on psychology as well. He lived from 470 BC to 399 BC. The important part of this slide, if you're taking notes, and I hope you are, I'm going to have to adjust my camera just a little bit to catch all this, I think. There we go. He wanted to get to the truth by constant questioning. He stressed that he didn't know the answer to anything. People would ask him questions because they considered him to be wise, and he would always say, I don't really know the answer. He would just turn it around and ask another question to try to get as close to the truth as possible. This is the guy that was made to drink the poison hemlock. If you remember the story, he was basically accused of being a disruptive influence on the youth of Athens, Greece. His major contribution to psychology is this, and that's important for your notes right here. He established that everything must be open to question. And we still hold that to be true in psychology. Psychology is a science, and we constantly question our conclusions. We want to replicate everything to make sure we get similar results. If we don't, then maybe we're off on something. So we're constantly wanting to question and be open to the idea that things could change or be different at some point. Plato was the next ancient Greek philosopher. He came after Socrates, lived from 427 BC to 347 BC. He was the successor of Socrates. He was one of the first people to point out that we learn through our senses. And his major contribution to psychology, again, is the asterisk point here, and that's what you really want to have in your notes from this slide more than anything. He recognized the importance of individual differences. That's his major contribution to psychology. It's okay to be different, and we all are very different in a lot of ways. And he was the first to kind of recognize that importance. Then we have Aristotle, the last of the ancient Greek philosophers that I want to talk about. 384 BC to 322 BC. So again, we're talking about a long time ago. He was more of a scientist. Aristotle was more of a scientist than a philosopher. The first two were more philosophers. His important contribution, again, the thing to have in your notes from this slide, this point right here, he was the first to pronounce that people are born with a blank slate. This is called tabula rasa. That literally translates to blank slate. He said that our lives were like an empty chalkboard, and that the experiences of life would fill those chalkboards in for us. Okay? To explain that a little bit more, he was basically saying that it's, people are born with not necessarily innate or inborn abilities as much as it is that the experiences of life will shape and mold how people turn out. People of this persuasion might say, you could take 10 people of average intelligence, and if you put them in very different environments, they're going to turn out very differently because of their environment. If I take a really smart kid, but I put him in an environment where there are no schools, there are no books, you have parents who are very violent, very abusive, he's probably not going to rise to his full potential in school because his environment just stinks. Conversely, if you take someone who is even a little bit below average intelligence, but you place him or her in a super environment with great schools, with parents who encourage learning and education, that child can turn out to be an honor student. So, the environment has a lot to do with how we turn out, maybe, everything to do with how we turn out according to this view. And again, another random cute pet picture, just for you to enjoy. This is my cat, Sammy. Not that you care, but anyway. Okay. A few more people that I want to introduce you to. Descartes was a British mathematician and philosopher, lived from 1596 to 1650. So we're moving ahead quite a bit. We're jumping through several periods of history, but that's okay. You may not know him, but you might have heard of his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." He believed in empiricism. Now this is his important contribution for psychology. Right here, we're going to see that. He believed in empiricism. This is a philosophy that stressed the only way of obtaining knowledge is through the senses. You might think, well, duh. But the only way that we can really understand or know anything is to experience it through our senses, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our noses, etc. And that's his major contribution to psychology. The idea that psychology strives to be a science and that we try to sort of come up with conclusions objectively as opposed to subjectively is really, really important. You've probably heard of Charles Darwin. He was a British scientist. The Whole Voyage of the Beagle, you've probably heard of this guy. Not the best picture of Darwin I could find, but it'll do. 1809 to 1882. Ideas that are associated with Darwin are natural selection and survival of the fittest. Those are probably the terms that you guys have heard of and have maybe discussed in other classes. Now, Darwin was talking about natural selection and survival of the fittest, not in human terms, but in terms of sort of like, plants, maybe even, animals, but not with people. Darwin was always very careful to say his ideas were not to be applied to human beings. However, people like Herbert Spencer came along, who was a philosopher in England, who lived from 1820 to 1903, and applied those ideas of Darwin to the human population. He said, well, if natural selection and survival of the fittest are concepts that apply to plants and animals, certainly they apply to human beings as well. With natural selection, basically the traits that ensure survival the most are the ones that are passed down from one generation to the next. Survival of the fittest simply means that those organisms that are most suited and most adapted to their environments are going to survive. Those that are not well suited to their environment are going to die off. So people started to look at society and say, why are we helping people who are poor, who are needy? Because they should be weeding themselves out. If we help them, it's just going to make the human population even more weak or less strong, however you want to conceive of that. And this led to some pretty upsetting and controversial ideas from people like Adolf Hitler that we'll talk about here in just a second. Let's just go ahead and call that the end of this piece right here. Thank you.